Ah, no doubt you've agreed to let him have your name for his midsummer fair. No doubt you've agreed to take an interest in his communistic factory. But has it occurred to either of you, either to you, Mr. Mayor, or to you, Father, what this struggle really implies? The Marquis looked sharply at Bloody Johnny, who was now rapidly recovering his usual sang-froid. "Do you want me to shut this lad's mouth, your worship?" he said with a chuckle. "Or shall we follow the fashion of the hour and give you its free thing?" "By all means, it's fling," replied the Mayor of Glastonbury gravely. "Go ahead, Mr. Zoylan, I like your frankness. I'll repay it, never fear, when you've had your say, in the same coin if I can." "Bravo, Gerd, bravo!" cried my lord, his little sharp eyes glancing with real relish from one to the other. He began, indeed, to assume the expression of a virtuoso at a bear baiting or a cockfight. Lady Rachel, who knew her father pretty well, began to feel sorry for a rider upon the roan mare. He has no idea how wicked and wilful father can be, she thought. Our wily mayor here has doubtless already committed you, father, and you too, Rachel, I'll be bound, to his precious midsummer antics and to his communistic experiment. All I want to point out, both to him and to you, is simply this." As he spoke, the great yellow-bearded swashbuckler shifted his position in his hard-backed library chair and flung one leather-gaitered leg over its arm. "Simply this, that you're both on the losing side. Inevitably, by a law of nature impossible to invade, Philip Crow is going to win. No midsummer fairs, no rush of tourists to Glastonbury from overseas, no municipal factories filled with souvenirs, no bribing of dirty cads like Barter can prevent Philip Crow from winning. You've only make an ass out of yourself before the whole county, father, if you go into this, just as you will of yourself, if I may so say so, Mr. Gerd. It won't do. You're heading for disaster. The strike that's beginning now, engineered by that little fool of a brother-in-law of mine, will be utterly broken in a month or two. The laboring men of Glastonbury aren't idiots. They'll see, quickly enough, on which side of the bread their butter is. Crow has the brains. Crow has the cash. Crow has the banks behind him and the great upper middle class behind him. He has, above everything else, the economic traditions of England behind him. You can't beat Crow, my good Mr. Gerd. Hire all the play actors you please, you can't beat him." He jerked his legs back from across his chair arm and stretched it straight out of the side of the other, thrusting his hands deep into his pockets. "I'll tell you a secret, father. A secret of high politics. And you can make it all the use of it as you please, my dear Mr. Gerd. Philip Crow doesn't want Glastonbury flooded with visitors from overseas. That's not his taste, and I don't blame him. All this semi-religious hocus-pocus doesn't in the end do any good to a town. What does good to a town is to have plenty of work, real work, not this sycophantic, parasitic sponging on visitors, not all this poppycock about the Holy Grail. I tell you, I can see the whole thing as clearly as if I were a bloody oracle. You can smile as much as you like, father. What I'm saying is the truth. The strike in Crow's factories will only hurt the people. Dave Spear's a young idealistic fool, a mere bookish doctrinaire. So are you too, my good Mr. Gerd, if you'll let me say so, with your midsummer fairs. What you've managed to do is simply this. You've divided the place into two camps. On your side are all the fattists and the cranks and the softheads. On Crow's side is hard common sense. And let me tell you that in our old English, even yet, it'll be common sense that'll win." He stopped recklessly and, pouring out all the milk that was left in the milk jug into the unused slop basin, swallowed it and a couple of gulps. The Marquis of P exchanged glances with his daughter. The Mayor of Glastonbury clasped his plump hands on the edge of the table and leant forward as if to speak. Then he changed his mind and clasped his fingers and sank back in his chair. Lady Rachel said, "This new factory of Mr. Garrett's is going to manufacture little figures. They are going to be figures of people like Arthur and Merlin. I'd sooner put my faith in these little figures, Will, than in all your common sense." Those sound fun. I like one. William Zoyland emitted a merry laugh. "Merlin, forsooth," he cried. "Well, Rachel, I suppose this is the right place for bringing Merlin in. But I've never yet heard of the mayor or any modern town who would pin his faith upon Merlin." A long silence fell upon the group of 4 persons, a silence that was only broken by the crying of the wind in the great chimney above their heads. Then the Marquis said, "It's all very well for a healthy materialist like you, Will, to scoff at our old superstitions. I've noticed, however, that neither you nor anyone else I've talked to who've come to this house will ever agree to sleep the night in King Mark's gallery here." "Do you mean the big room, Lord P?" inquired Mr. Geard, "that they say extends along the whole top floor of Mark's court?" He paused for a minute. "I've often heard of this big room," he went on, "but I've never met anyone who's seen it." Will Zallen got up from his feet with a movement that shook the tea table and made the cups and saucers rattle. "I tell you what, Mr. Geard, you mayor of Glastonbury," he muttered in a queer, husky voice, "if you'd sleep a whole night in that room up there, I'd say there was some bloody spunk at any rate, in this precious pageant of yours." "William," protested the Marquis, "you're going a bit too far, my boy." Rachel's face had gone white and her eyes had grown large and very dark. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Will," she murmured in a tone that was scarcely audible. But Mr. Gear's aplomb and self-possession had completely come back to him. He looked quietly at his host. "I don't want to intrude," he said slowly, "or to outstay my welcome, but if there were any way of getting a message to my family, I'd be honored, I say honored, to sleep tonight in the room you're talking about." "Don't let him, father. Oh, you mustn't let him," cried Lady Rachel with passionate intensity. Bloody Johnny stretched out one of his plump hands and touched the young girl's knee. "Listen, child," he said solemnly. Rachel, still very white, looked him in the face. "I swear to you, Lady Rachel," said the mayor of Glastonbury slowly, "that I shall be all right up there." He was the first of the 2 of them to remove his eyes. As soon as he had done so, the girl drew a long breath and smiled, in a rush of blood flooding her cheek, and even her soft, thin neck, with a lovely rose tint, suffused her pale skin. Mr. Gaird's own gaze encountered now the bold, restless, unsympathetic stare of Will Zoyland. The Marquis of P, who after his fashion was no mean discerner of spirits, thought to himself, "Hurrah for old Johnny! I'll be damned if he hasn't picked himself up. There's nothing of the bounder about him now. He's standing up to Will now." "I don't mean to say," pronounced Mr. Geard emphatically, "that there are not terrors which are beyond my powers to overcome or to exercise. I'll confess at once, Mr. Zoyland, that if there are bugs and fleas and spiders and dust up there, I here and now retract my pledge. But if your people, my lord," and he turned to the Marquis, "have cleaned up that room fairly lately, and if you can get your sergeant to carry up some kind of bed there, I'd love to spend the night under your roof. Only someone must tell my family." The Marquis gave an imperceptible shrug of his shoulders, as much as to say, "I'm beginning to wish I were alone here with my daughter, as I intended to be." But he rose stiffly to his feet, went to the mantelpiece, and rang the bell. Sergeant Blimp must have been driven out of the warmth of the kitchen by the spiteful hatred of the old couple, for he answered his master's ring almost as quickly as if he had been standing on the threshold like an old-fashioned man-at-arms. The way he now presented himself within the restricted radiance of the candlelight, and stood erect and silent there, suggested to Bloody Johnny's mind the idea that he carried a hauberk, or at least an arquebus. And now, my friend, those are words I will have to look up, because I've